Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra video where I give you the contextual information regarding this war to give you a greater understanding of the conflict. And where should we start? Well, let's go to the news of Dragon's Teeth. Russia reinforces fortifications in Kursk Oblast. So the Kursk Oblast is basically up here. There's Kursk. This is a Kursk Oblast. And there are, I talked this morning about Sumy being really badly shelled, loads of projectiles, 226 projectiles yesterday against Sumy there. So there is attack from Russia from Kursk into Ukraine. And now in Kursk, they are laying out anti-tank obstacles along the Russo-Ukrainian border. All goes according to plan. And this fits in with the intelligence update from the UK MOD, or actually from Defence Intelligence. Russia has recently started extending defensive positions along its international border with Ukraine and deep inside its Belgorod region. On 6th of December 2022, the governor of Belgorod announced he was establishing local self-defense units. Trench digging has been reported in Belgorod since at least April 2022, but the new constructions are probably more elaborate systems designed to rebuff mechanized assault. There is a realistic possibility that the Russian authorities are promoting defensive preparations within internationally recognized Russian territory to burnish patriotic feeling. However, it probably illustrates some Russia decision makers' genuine but false belief that there is a credible threat of invasion by Ukrainian forces. I'm not so sure about that. I think if you start whipping up ideas of the Ukrainians possibly attacking Russia, I don't think they genuinely believe that. Maybe they do, I don't know. But to me, it's a good way of, or potentially a good way of whipping up feelings of Russians against Ukraine, and it allows you to then mobilize troops within this area as an excuse that we're going to be attacked. We're going to be attacked. We're going to be attacked all around here, Belgorod, Kursk. Let's mobilize all these troops, and then suddenly we've got a load more troops, and these people feel threatened themselves by Ukraine. It's just a false narrative. Paucity in strategic assessment is one of the critical weaknesses in the central Russian government architecture, as highlighted by Russia's original decision to invade Ukraine. Impartial official analysis is almost certainly frequently undermined by a tendency toward groupthink and politically expedient conclusions. So, linking to this idea of defences being built, Igor Strelkov, or Igor Girkin, who is this military war blogger, but was also hugely important previously in the Donbass in the 2014 war. So, in fact, if we look for him, Igor Girkin, let's just give ourselves a reminder of who he is. Self-described Russian nationalist, alias Igor Strelkov. Russian Army veteran and former Federal Security Services FSB officer who played a key role in the annexation of Crimea. So he led a group of militants down into the Donbass during 2014, sort of Little Green Men. And then he actually became the de facto military commander of all the separatist forces in the Donbass region. And that was confirmed by the Prime Minister of the DPR before he was then dismissed in August 2014. He's just been done in The Hague for the shooting down of the MH17. Dutch prosecutors have charged him and 3 others, and now 3 of them have been found guilty of the murder of the 298 people. So there you go. That's who he is, and he's been a military blogger. But then he took himself down, or different sort of theories as to how he ended up on the front line, possibly volunteered and ended up down there. But he's then come back to Moscow now and has written about his experiences down there, and he's pretty damning of the Russian command structure, and what he said is pretty controversial. So he gives a lot of detail talking about how he was in a particular battalion, particular regiment, but he was there, eventually found out he's there kind of unofficially, like his name wasn't on any of the lists, and then he was like, well, I'm fighting illegally, I'm illegally carrying weapons, so on and so forth. I just sort of take you through that here. So, further informal investigation allowed in general terms to establish the following. Shortly after being enrolled in the marching company, I was transferred to the something battalion, in which I was enrolled for exactly one day. In the morning, I was listed. In the evening, I was taken out without a trace. All these manipulations, probably done under pressure from above, were not formalised by any orders. As a result, from October to the end of November, I was illegally in the battalion of the regiment, illegally carried weapons and ammunition, illegally travelled to the area of the SMO, the the special military operation, and to the frontline zone. If something happened to me during those trips, then should I explain that it would be filed exclusively as the quote amateur activity of the adventurer Girkin, end quote, or at best as an accident during quote volunteer activities, end quote, with a corresponding complete lack of obligations on the part of the armed forces of the Russian Federation (DPR) and the state in relation to me. The commander of the regiment and the battalion knew about all this, but receiving very solid assistance for for their unit, food, equipment, vehicles, funds for money, the flow of volunteers, etc., due to my stay in the regiment and battalion, they preferred not to tell me. So eventually he leaves, right, and he goes back to Moscow because he's like, I'm not supposed to be here. Well, at least I'm not on the list anymore. They're only keeping me here because of I bring in, because I'm this big famous guy. I bring in food, equipment, vehicles, fuels, funds for fuel, and flow of volunteers to this unit, to this battalion. So you know, there's no need for me to be here, and you guys suck. So he then goes back to Russia and to Moscow, and then he's written a really sort of damning assessment of the command structure and basically everything that's going on there. So he's not very complimentary about the things that happen there. And now briefly discuss, and now also briefly on the impressions of the trip, which was inconclusive but not useless, since my eyes and ears remained with me and my head is also still working. Naturally, I intend to keep the vast majority of my impressions and conclusions to myself, to, so to speak, not to discredit. Positive impressions I will share in the upcoming, hopefully, video conferences, but there are not too many of them in relation to the negative ones. In other words, Strelkov had a really bad experience of the front line, of the commanders, of the war, of everything. And this is the key of what he was saying, of what he said. And I will only note that the basis of all our quote increasing victories on the fronts and directions of the special military operation is the deepest crisis of strategic planning. Simply put, the troops are fighting by inertia, not having the slightest idea of the ultimate strategic goals of the current military campaign, and only guessing about the vague plans of the command for such grandiose, senseless gestures as a construction of a completely insane in its uselessness, but wildly expensive in terms of execution cost, Surovikin line. In other words, all those dragon's teeth and tank traps and tank trenches and revetments and trenches, he says, are grandiose, senseless gestures and really completely insane and useless, but wildly expensive. Fascinating. In most parts of the Russian armed forces, soldiers and officers do not understand. This is so crucial. It's incredibly important what he says here, because it goes to the heart of the problem. For what purposes they are fighting in general. For them, the condition of victory, or just the condition for ending the war, is a mystery. So they don't know why they're fighting and what their aims are, how they win. And the authorities of the Russian Federation are not able to explain this to them, since setting a clear goal for the SMO means limiting room for manoeuvre. That is, losing the opportunity to declare the goals of the SMO as achieved at any moment that the Kremlin leaders consider convenient. For the thousandth time, I remind you that they passionately desired, quote, reconciliation with partners, for which many steps are being taken to this day, which demoralizes society and the army, is unattainable in principle, but the Kremlin and the Old Square do not want to believe in it. Such sentiments, specifically in the troops, lead to apathy. Apathy, on the other hand, leads to a drop in morale and the fulfillment of the tasks set for show and slip of the sleeves without a real interest in their successful results. So in the army of the armed forces of the Russian Federation and parts of the armed forces of the LDNR, although the fighters have much more motivation, apathy prevails. So that's interesting. The LDNR, the LDR and the LNR, those fighters, those militants from the Donbass region, themselves have much greater morale than those brought in from Russia, as you would imagine. The absence of a clear military political strategy does not allow the military to develop tactics that will contribute to its implementation. In the meantime, on a whim, the Russian armed forces are preparing for a protracted positional war, building long-term structures along the entire front in the style of a la the Mannerheim line, but nowhere near the Maginot line. The fact that following the strategy of a protracted war is suicide for the Russian Federation and its authorities and elites too, by the way. I wrote about it back in 2014, but also said more than once or twice that the very beginning of the current, from the very beginning of the current campaign. Therefore, watching how the enemy slowly and without encountering any opposition implements his own strategic tasks with the complete passivity of the military and political authorities of the Russian Federation, I do not expect anything good at the front in the coming weeks. And yes, the so-called Ukraine will not freeze in winter, will not rebel, and will not fight worse. Vice versa, it's soldiers who have already believed in their strength as a result of the autumn victories of the armed forces of Ukraine and are fully supported by NATO, will only fight harder and harder against the Muscovites, avenging the hardships that their relatives and friends in the rear are forced to bear. And they will be met only by apathetic performance of duty, behind which many fighters and commanders have long been looming the unresolved question: what are we doing here? If Moscow is most concerned with the implementation of grain deals, the unhindered pumping of ammonia through Odessa, and a price ceiling on gas and oil supplied to numerous Western partners. Sorry to spend so long on that, but this is one of the key military bloggers, but key players in the political game surrounding Ukraine as far as Russia is concerned, and he is absolutely condemning the command structure right up and down the line, but also expressing how the troops themselves have no idea what they're fighting for. They're completely apathetic. They don't know what success looks like. If you don't know what success looks like, then you're just walking around like a zombie on the battlefield. You are just entirely a victim to the commands of those above, the really centralized command. You're not enfranchised at all. And this perhaps is the difference, although some people say this is overplayed and that the Ukrainians really are quite similar to this, but the idea is that Ukrainians have been given this kind of NATO training, which gives the NCOs, non-commissioned officers, enfranchised, power to make decisions, reactive decisions on the battlefield. And in order to make decisions, they have to have information as well, so they're better informed. The troops know what they're fighting for. The Ukrainian troops know what they're fighting for anyway, right? This is a fight for their own homeland, for their families, for their businesses, for their lifestyle, for everything, for their culture, for their history. For the Russians they're what? Fighting for someone else's grain deal, fighting for the price cap on gas and oil, fighting for the elites back in Russia. Well, what are they there for? And how do they win? And therefore, apathy. They don't really care. So they're going to be completely ineffective. Hugely important. Right. Let's move on to something completely different. Here is the work of the recovery vehicle M1089A1P2 somewhere in Ukraine. This is an American vehicle. I think that three of them have been given to the Ukrainians. This is basically, if you can imagine what the Jawas do in Star Wars and put it into Ukraine, this is it.
Новый челлендж покажи на...
There some kind of ARV, armored recovery vehicle, picking up bits of scrap metal, bits of destroyed equipment, and then putting them on some kind of big truck and taking them back. All very useful. And you wonder, is this all just going to get smelted down? Are there parts that can be somehow recovered, like some kind of mobile scrapyard that they can use in vehicles that need them? Probably both. Um, so talking about Gepards, talking about this yesterday about how Switzerland are not allowing the munitions that they have manufactured, that the rounds for the Gepard that are in really short supply, they aren't allowing other countries to give those munitions or sell those munitions on to Ukraine. Germany no longer wants to buy Swiss ammunition as a result of this. From Berlin's point of view, Bern, so Switzerland, is no longer a reliable armaments supplier. The dispute over the anti-aircraft tank Gepard has consequences far beyond the Gepard. So this is hurting possibly the Swiss armaments manufacturing industry, as people will say, well, if we can't sell them on to anyone, if we can't give them to anyone, if you're tying our hands in this unreasonable way, then we're not going to buy ammunition from you. And this is where Ukraine needs to be building their own stuff, which they are starting to do. And in fact, that is looking like, well, we'll come on to that. So, in terms of their drones, that's really important. They do that, and partly because of this. So, the United States has hobbled HIMARS provided to Ukraine, so the systems cannot fire longer-range munitions. The practical effect of this sabotage is to protect the sites from which the Russian terrorist state attacks Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure. So, Michael McKay is not happy about this, as you can see. But actually, you can understand why they might have done this. America have done an awful lot, and we'll come on to that in a second. And this then might force Ukraine to build their own stuff, which then safeguards America from being blamed for stuff. So you look at then a quote like this: Ukraine war, US neither encouraged nor enabled Kiev to strike inside Russia. This is Antony Blinken. Really want to cover their backs to say, okay, America helping out Ukraine, but we haven't given them stuff. We didn't help them. We didn't advise them on blowing up stuff in Russia, which is kind of like, it's not so much slopey shoulders. They need to position themselves very carefully in this, because as soon as Russia start really causally connecting things happening in Russia to the Americans, all hell breaks loose. So on the one hand, it's easy to criticize America for wanting to put out messaging like this, but on the other hand, they absolutely have to. You've got to understand the geopolitical ramifications of not doing this and allowing America to be connected to attacks within Russia. You know, that could be the start of World War III, and America are really sensitive to that. And so the idea that they've hobbled HIMARS so that they can't fire into Russia is something that you can imagine them doing. Of course, if they've still got 84-kilometer range missiles, it renders this all pointless, because you could put a HIMARS just here and that can fire into Belgorod just fine, thank you very much. So it is kind of arbitrary. But what's interesting is a conversation just below here, actually. So, no, wrong one, this one. Um, so this is below the tweet that Michael McKay put out about HIMARS. Um, I somehow think Ukraine might figure out how to unhobble the HIMARS, furthermore, make the long range ammunition to use a greater range they want. It might not take much longer. Ukraine have taken things into their own hands and developed their own long range weapons, since no country would provide what they needed. My understanding is that they have developed a long range drone. And it's this kind of stuff that, yeah, if no one's going to help us, we'll do it ourselves. But then there's almost certainly going to be US help in doing that, right? So it's like there are different levels of politics going on here. And there's a real politic of America having to position themselves very openly and publicly. But if Ukraine are going to be making their own munitions, you can imagine that there will be other people helping them do this. Um, and here, you know, this guy says, I doubt it took Ukraine an hour to undo it. That's political cover, uh, and uh, and I think that that's probably correct. That by doing this and saying this, right, the America are covering their own asses, and this is political cover. They say, look, we disabled HIMARS from being able to send these rockets, right? So if Ukraine do anything with that, they've just changed the way we've set this up, and they've adapted our tech, and that's on Ukraine. So if Ukraine use HIMARS to actually send rockets 150 kilometers into Russia, that ain't us. We disabled that. If they've undisabled it, that's on them. So it just gives America political cover. And I think you can kind of understand that. Let's not be hard on America and the United States, because let's look at what they've actually done. So this is the Financial Times releasing military, humanitarian, and financial support for Ukraine, according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. So the United States has produced well uh, over and above what anyone else has in terms of all three. Sorry, okay, military and humanitarian. Financial aid, actually, the EU institutions have produced more, but then that's a collection of institutions rather than one country, one nation. Again, like I've said before on these stats, you've got to be really mindful of the size of the GDP. So if America has much more money to give and much more military stuff, if they've got more military stuff you can poke a hairy stick at, then they have a much it's much easier for them to be generous. For example, if a homeless person has got like £10 to their name and they give you £1 to go and, because you need £1 for the parking meter, right? Then that's like 10% of their income. They're 10% of everything they own. That's amazing. But if a millionaire comes along and gives you £1,000, you're like, wow, that's amazing. But actually, if £1,000 out of their millions, right, is relatively little, whereas £1 out of this guy's £10 is huge, right? So therefore, when you look at someone like I don't know, maybe the Netherlands, that's potentially as important as the United Kingdom as far as what their GDP is. Now, I'm making that up. It might not be the case. So, what strikes me as interesting here is France. So France is a G7 member, one of the biggest economies of the world, and they have produced relatively little. Germany has really stepped up to the mark recently. UK has done a really good job. The EU in general is helping out an awful lot. But we're going to come on to that in a second. And the US is big time there. Um, and the other thing that impresses me is Canada, actually. Canada and Poland. Poland, for reasons they're becoming a bit of a powerhouse in Europe. Poland, certainly militarily speaking. And Canada, though, is so you can understand Poland. They're right next door and they feel very threatened. But Canada, on the other hand, is actually, giving quite a lot of stuff, and that seems that one surprised me. Anyway, going on from there, actually, I didn't want to this is going to be make more sense to say next, which is Hungary is blocking 18 billion euros of aid for Kiev from the EU, and this is causing a bit of a problem. So another 18 billion of aid from here, that's huge. There's a big lot of money, and Viktor Orban, who's mates with Vladimir Putin, is being Viktor Orban, and I detest Viktor Orban. And he's being really difficult. So if you're pro-Ukraine, you should be anti-Orban and what Hungary is not doing. What they are doing is putting a kibosh on a lot of the things that the EU is trying to do, and this is then causing lots of knock-on effects with other areas of EU decision making. But it's interesting that they might have $7.5 billion euros, sorry, of EU cohesion funds not given to them. So there could be really big ramifications of this, and another 5.8 billion euros in recovery grants. So this is COVID recovery, I think that uh, just they could be biting off their nose to spite their face, or they are looking for concessions somewhere. So they could be playing a clever game. The Hungarians, I don't know, but as a result, the EU are now looking for alternative solutions to get around this, and sort of changing the rules to allow that to happen. Um, and finally, Zelenskyy. A lot of people have noted that he went to the front line on the Armed Forces Day, which I think was that yesterday. Yeah, I think it was yesterday. Zelenskyy at the front near Sloviansk in the National Day of the Armed Forces in Ukraine. True leadership. So Sloviansk, just to let you know, is there. So he's moved fairly close to the front line. He was in, I think it was at Izium when just after that was liberated, or it might have been Liman. I think it was Izium. He's also been down to Kherson the other day, just after that was liberated, and this just is really good optics. And you had Russian soldiers and Russian correspondents, actually war correspondents, reporting back from the Kherson area saying, "How can he get there and not be taken out by the Russians? What are we doing how are we allowing their leader to go and do this? It's just really good optics for the Ukrainians and really bad look for us. And Putin, well, he did go to the Kerch Bridge yesterday and drive across it in a black Mercedes. Um, Again, really different optics. So here you've got Zelenskyy in in his famous sort of greens and stuff, just looking like he's one of them. And to these guys, he is one of them. He is them in Parliament, showing true leadership and whatnot. And that's got to be good for the Ukrainians and look bad for the Russians. Anyway, there you go. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you for all my subscribers. Thanks to the channel members who every month contribute to my channel. Really, really appreciate that. And we've got Cynthia Chenot, who is a new member today. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Really appreciate all the help you guys give. If you fancy grabbing some of my books, I have 2 fiction books that are available on beautiful paperback. This is a lovely matte cover. Survival of the Fittest, Metamorphosis, and Survival of the Fittest Adaptation. They're available on ebook as well, so you can get them in various formats, but that would really help me out and gives you something to read. Whoop-de-doo. Anyway, thank you so much for your support. You take care, and I'll speak to you later.